This week's Torah portion is called Toldot. Toldot literally means the offspring. And it speaks about the offspring of Isaac and Rebekah, the famous twins of Jacob and Esau, as we will see presently. The Torah portion of Toldos, Isaac and Rebekah endure 20 childless years until their prayers are answered. And Rebekah conceives. She experiences a difficult pregnancy as the children struggle inside her. Hashem tells her that there are two nations in your womb and that the younger will prevail over the elder. Esau emerges first. Jacob is born clutching Esau's heel. Esau grows up to be a cunning hunter, a man of the field. Jacob, Yaakov, is a wholesome man, a dweller in the tents of learning, studying Torah. Isaac favors Esau. Rebekah loves Jacob. Returning exhausted and hungry from the hunt one day, Esau sells his birthright, his rights as the firstborn, to Jacob for a pot of red lentil stew. Some expensive red lentil stew there. In Gerar, in the land of the Philistines, Isaac presents Rebekah as his sister out of fear that he will be killed by someone coveting her beauty. He farms the land, reopens the wells dug by his father, Avraham, and digs a series of his own wells. Over the first two, there is strife with the Philistines, but the waters of the third well are enjoyed in tranquility. The Torah portion then continues that Esau marries two Hittite women. Isaac grows old and blind and expresses his desire to bless Esau before he dies. While Esau goes off to hunt his father's favorite food, Rebekah dresses Jacob in Esau's clothes, covers his arms and neck with goat skins to simulate the feel of his hairier brother, prepares a small dish, and sends Jacob to his father. Jacob receives his father's blessings for the dew of the heaven and the fat of the land and mastery over his brother. When Esau returns and the deception is revealed, all Isaac can do for his weeping son is predict that he will live by his sword, and that when Jacob falters, the younger brother will forfeit his supremacy over the elder. Jacob leaves home for Haran. Haran is roughly where modern-day Syria, Iraq is, which is where Rebekah was originally from, to flee Esau's wrath and to find a wife in the family of his mother's brother, Laban. Esau marries a third wife, Machalat, the daughter of Yishmael. And that's how this week's Torah portion concludes. Tonight, we're going to be discussing an interesting point, which is discussed in this week's Torah portion. And more broader so, throughout various areas in the Torah, we're going to be discussing, as the title of the class suggests, the Jewish claim to the land of Israel. Before we get into the Torah-based claims that we're going to be discussing tonight, it's important to give an overview of the other claims, the common arguments which are collected around in an effort to gain proper perspective on what we're discussing, the common arguments for the Jewish right to the land of Israel, to our homeland. And so here we go. Why is Israel ours? What makes it ours? Israel bashing has been something that has been around for generations. Jew haters have always picked on Israel from the creation of the state of Israel, and even before, there was always something connected to the land of Israel and anti-Semites. Now, what do we stand for? What really is our claim to the land? So what are some of the commonly cited arguments to the land of Israel? The first one is international law. One argument of international law is saying that it's ours because following the Ottoman Empire's fall to the land of Israel, which was called Palestine at the time, the League of Nations the British conquered Palestine, which was a former territory of theirs, and they accepted the Balfour Declaration in 1917 that they will establish a Jewish homeland in Palestine. And later the League of Nations presented the partition plan, which will be half for the Arabs and half for the Jews. And it was approved by the United Nations. The Jews accepted, the Arabs did not. Thus erupted the Israeli Independence War, and we all know how that ended. And so This idea is that it's ours because the nations of the world said it's ours, beginning in the Balfour Declaration, ending with the partition plan, which was approved by the United Nations. We want it fair and square. It is ours in international law. As a matter of fact, this claim is even mentioned in the Israeli Declaration of Independence. First claim. What's the second claim? The second claim is Jewish survival. We endured suffering throughout history. No one was there to help us, especially under Nazi Europe. We tried to get into many nations and no one allowed us in. Most didn't allow us in, as we know all the infamous stories of the various situations, the example of the Jews on the St. Louis, and many, many more stories where Jews were not allowed elsewhere. And now the Jews need a homeland because only as a sovereign people will we be able to defend ourselves. This second reason is also mentioned as a legitimate reason, as a fact of legitimacy in the Israeli Declaration of Independence of why we need the land of Israel. We need a country to call our own. We can't be stateless. A third reason, a third argument, which is presented is our historical connection to the land. We're there for 3,000 years. There were the reigns of King Solomon, King David before him, the kingdoms of Judah and Israel. We know it from the historical side. We know it from the archaeological side. We know that it's ours. There's been a steady, consistent, constant Jewish presence in the state, in the land of Israel. In Eretz Yisrael, in the land of Israel, from its inception as a Jewish state until today. And discussions vary how many Jews, but there's always been Jews there. And aside from that, all our prayers, discussions, everything is associated and focused on the land of Israel. Yes, we may have been evicted. Yes, we may have been overpowered, but it has always been our ancestral homeland. Now, these three arguments are strong, and combined, they make for quite a compelling and strong case for the Jewish right to the land of Israel. And some suggest we should teach this to our students, we should teach this to other people, we should teach this to expose the hypocrisy and the double standards of the Israel haters and the anti-Semites. It would make a huge difference, and probably so. But the truth is, if we're looking to make our case as strong as possible, we have to analyze the counter arguments to this case, because we have to make sure our case is as strong as possible. And I'm not saying I agree with those counter arguments, but here are three counter arguments to what we've just presented. First one is, we said it's international law. The reality is that in strict legal case, international law may be sufficient for our right to the land of Israel, a land of Israel. But the anti-Semites and those who are anti-Israel are not impressed by this. In their mind, the Balfour Declaration had no moral right, and the UN had no moral right to say that the land belongs to the Jewish people. Who gave them the right? It was illegal, immoral, colonial activity to begin with. The second argument of Jewish survival doesn't have to be in the land of Israel. It can be in anywhere, as we all know, infamously or famously. They entertained the idea of Uganda, Kenya, and that area to have a big swath of land that will home the Jewish state. Nothing to do with the land of Israel. And it's a counter argument. If you need a place for Jewish survival, it doesn't have to be in the homeland in what is now known as Israel. And another counter argument to the idea, the third argument that we presented, is the historic link. But the reality is, just because someone has a historic link doesn't mean that they have a right to it now. History is filled with people conquering land. Conquering land is a accepted form of moving people about the world. It's something which is done for generations, for decades, for centuries, for millennia. It's something that always was. And if we're going to go to ancestral homelands and homelands that have been around for thousands of years, you know what? The land of Israel isn't the Jewish ancestral homeland. The land of Israel is the Canaanites' ancestral homeland. They were there before the Jews, before King David conquered the land of Israel. The Canaanites were there. So if we're going to say it's ours because we've been there for 3,000 years, the Canaanites will come and say it's ours because we've been there for 4,000 years, right? Do we say that the Greeks have the right to take Egypt? The Greeks ruled Egypt. Just because that following the Greeks came the Romans, and following the Romans came the Muslims, maybe the Greeks should retake Egypt. It's their rightful homeland. How about the Dutch should retake New York, right? It was theirs before, right? The indigenous Indians, as they were called, I don't know, what are they called politically correct now? The indigenous tribes here in the United States, maybe we should give the United States back to them, following this thought process of being indigenous people to the land of Israel. Now, I'm not vouching for these counter arguments, but suffice it to say that some of them are powerful points and put a dent on the three arguments that are commonly presented. Tonight, we're going to learn the core of our claim to the land of Israel, the one that rises above any particular historical or political event, the one that comes from the true Torah, from God himself. And that begins with a verse from this week's Torah portion. We're on page 70, if you have the book. There's a famine in the land of Israel called then Canaan, and this is where Isaac and Rebekah live. There's a famine, and they're entertaining a move south to Egypt where there's no famine and there'll be enough food. But their plan is scratched. And why is it scratched? Text 1a from this week's Torah portion. And God appeared to Isaac and said, do not go down to Egypt, dwell in the land that I will tell you. The land of Israel, the land of Canaan, which is where he lived. Why should he not leave the land of Israel? That's what Abraham did when there was a famine. He went to Egypt. Why is Isaac different than his father Abraham? So we have our favorite commentary, Rashi, text 1b. One more verse. Sojourn in this land, and I will be with you, says God, and I will bless you, for to you and to your seed will I give all these lands, and I will establish the oath that I swore to Abraham, your father. Land of Israel. It's your land. Don't leave it. And Rashi will explain, based on the Midrash, that Isaac wasn't allowed to leave the land of Israel because he had been brought as a sacrifice on Mount Moriah. Granted, it was never carried out, but the mere fact that he was put upon the altar as a sacrifice, he now received the level of something consecrated to God. And because Isaac is now consecrated to God, just like a sacrifice, according to Jewish law, is not allowed to leave the boundaries of the country of Israel, the Holy Land, so too Isaac is not allowed to leave Israel. It's not befitting. The words of Rashi, do not go down to Egypt. Isaac had in mind to go down to Egypt as his father had gone down in the days of the famine. So Hashem said to him, do not go down to Egypt. You are as a perfect burnt offering. And being outside the Holy Land is not fitting to you. When we look at these verses in the commentary of Rashi, there's something that stands out. And that is, when was this stated? This was stated hundreds of years before the Jewish people conquered the land of Israel. Hundreds of years before they made it theirs. The Canaanites still ruled the land of Israel and a number of other families, collectively referred to as the Canaanites. They were non-Jews. They ruled the countries. It was theirs. Nonetheless, what does God tell him? It's a special land. It's your land. It has special status. And there are other verses in the Torah that reflect this land's special status even before the Jewish people conquered it 440 years later, after they left the land of Egypt, and after Mount Sinai, they conquer the land of Israel and it becomes the Jewish country. But this is almost 450 years earlier, 440 years earlier, 400 years earlier. It didn't happen yet. The verse also says on page 71, text 2a, on that day in the book of Genesis, God formed a covenant with Abraham saying, to your seed, I have given this land from the river of Egypt until the great river, the Euphrates River. And the Midrash explains, God's spoken word is considered like deed. As the verse states, to your seed, I have given this land. It does not state, I will give this land, but I have given this land. Here, God clearly says to Abraham, on that day, God formed a covenant with Abraham saying, to your seed, I have given this land. Because when God says something, it's as if it's considered like God did something, and God has already given the land of Israel to the Jewish people even before they actually conquered it. So if you're looking for a reason why the land belongs to us, why does Israel belong to us? Nothing to do with the UN. Nothing to do with us needing an ancestral homeland because it's been ours for 3,000 years, and nothing to do with the fact that we need a place to call home to defend ourselves. It is ours because God gave it to Abraham, and that's why it's ours. And so even if we lose it after many, many years, it's still ours. It's an eternal gift from God. Now, this reality that it's an eternal gift for God is not just something that's a nice statement. It actually has legal ramifications. And what I mean by that is many years later, when the Jewish people are in the desert and they're headed towards the land of Israel, there's a debate, and we're not going to get into the full discussion of the daughters of Tzalafchad. He had 5 daughters, he had passed away. And according to the initial transmission from God, only male inheritors got a portion in the land of Israel allotted to them. And so the 5 daughters came complaining to Moses and saying, just because our father passed away doesn't mean we don't deserve his plot of land. We should inherit his plot of land. And the obvious question is, according to Jewish law, you cannot inherit a plot of land that was never owned by someone. And in this case, Tzalafchad, their father, was never in Israel. He never retained ownership of the land. So why do they demand a share in his inheritance, which in fact they actually get once God tells Moses that that's indeed how it should work, if he never really owned it? And the sages explain that the reality is he did own it, because the land of Israel actually belonged to Abraham and to the Jewish people from the day God said, I will give it to Abraham. And so it was actually owned by the Jewish people, even while they were in Egypt, way before they conquered the land of Israel. It already belonged to Tzalafchad and the other Jewish people. So it has legal ramifications that it belongs to the Jewish people prior to the actual conquest. But the question is an obvious one. And the question that I'm referring to is this idea that it's all nice, fine, and dandy to say that the land of Israel belonged to Abraham, belonged to the Jewish people and his descendants from the moment God said, I have given it to him. But practically speaking, conventional wisdom and Torah wisdom says seemingly the opposite, that it didn't really belong to them until they actually arrived and conquered it. And proof is in the putting in the commandments of the Torah. There are commandments which are associated with ownership of the land of Israel, the tithing of fruits, the first fruits, and so on and so forth, the various commandments which are associated with the land of Israel. Those commandments did not go into effect, and the Torah is very clear about that, until the Jewish people entered the land of Israel and conquered it. Abraham did not have to fulfill those commandments. Any Jew, if for whatever reason there was a Jew living in Israel throughout those times, before the Jews conquered it after leaving Egypt, he would not have to fulfill those commandments. The obligation didn't happen yet. The consensus is that these laws only took effect when the Jewish people finished conquering and settling the land, which took them 14 years from once they entered it after their 40-year sojourn in the desert. Not only that, according to Maimonides, actually introduces this point in Jewish law and says that according to law, any part of Israel to be included in these obligations has to be conquered by a Jewish king. Text 4. We're on page 73. Whenever Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel, is mentioned, the intent is the lands conquered by the king of Israel or a prophet with the consent of the entire Jewish people. This is called a conquest of the community. If, however, an individual Jew, a family or a tribe goes and conquers a place for themselves, even in the land given to Abraham, is not considered as Eretz Yisrael in the sense that one is obligated to observe all the mitzvot there. All of the lands that the Jews who ascended from Egypt took possession of were sanctified in the first consecration of the land. When, by contrast, the descendants of the exiles ascended from Babylon and took possession of a portion of the land, they consecrated it a second time. This consecration is perpetuated forever, for that time and for all time. And so the question obviously is, if the land was never actually considered Eretz Yisrael until it was conquered during King David's time, what exactly was accomplished by God's gift to Abraham? Was it just in name? As we saw, there are some legal ramifications, so it can't be it was just honorific ownership. But on the other hand, we see it's not considered Israel for the laws associated with the land of Israel. So what are we talking about? And so what it would seem here is an interesting aspect where we can split it into two elements. When we talk about God giving us the land of Israel, there are 2 points. The first one is conferring ownership of the land, and the second is granting the land sanctity. In other words, by giving the land as a gift to a holy nation, the land now assumed a status as a holy land. The first element, conferring ownership of the land, was done when God told Abraham, I am giving you this land of Israel, the holy land, Eretz Yisrael, for you and for your descendants for eternity. And that's why it had legal ramifications regarding the ownership of the land with the daughters of Tzalafchat, because it was about ownership of the land, and that happened immediately when God said that this land is for Abraham and his descendants. But the sanctity of the land, the holiness of the land as a place with unique sanctity and a set of special commandments, special mitzvot, that was only conferred upon it once our ancestors actually captured it. Here's the words of the Rebbe, text 5. 2 things occurred when the land was given to the Jewish people. A, the monetary element, Jewish ownership of the land of Israel. B, the sanctity of the land. The first element, Jewish ownership of the land, was achieved by Hashem giving the land of Israel to Avram Avinu, our patriarch Abraham. But the second element, the land of Israel's sanctity, especially the special mitzvot that apply there, first occurred when the Jewish people entered the land. That's when it happened, when the Jewish people entered the land. And so we have this ownership versus the sanctity. But the question really is, it sounds very technical. It's a great answer, but it's a technical answer to our questions. But it leads to another question. What's the reason for this distinction? Why can't the 2 elements come together, ownership and sanctity? Why did God split these 2 elements? And if we determine that the word of God is considered done, is considered deed. So if God conferred ownership on the land upon Abraham and his descendants, why couldn't those same words confer sanctity on the ground itself? Why did there have to be a delay? The words of the Rebbe, page 76. The question arises, considering the view in the Midrash and Halacha that God's word conferred ownership of the land to Abraham and to his descendants after him, why can't we say that they conferred sanctity as well? In which case, the laws pertaining to the land would have gone into effect. Wouldn't that be simpler, easier? Wouldn't it make everything straightforward? Why did there have to be a delay? And the answer is one that we've discussed many, many times and at great length. And so we're going to repeat it briefly. What fundamental change happened between the time God said to Abraham, I am giving you this land, and the time that the Jewish people conquered it and settled it almost 500 years later after they left Egypt? What was something monumental? What was something life-changing that the Jewish people underwent? There were many things that happened. They went down to Egypt, the 12 tribes were born, Joseph became the viceroy of Egypt. They were enslaved for a few hundred years. The Exodus happened, the giving of the Torah happened, the wandering in the desert for 40 years. But the most monumental change, the greatest transformational event that the Jewish people experienced in that period was the giving of the Torah at Mount Sinai. Because the giving of the Torah at Mount Sinai is what changed everything. As we've discussed in the past, before the giving of the Torah at Mount Sinai, the ancestors fulfilled all the commandments. They put on tefillin, they kept Shabbos, they ate kosher food. Torah wasn't given yet, but they had the Torah and they studied it. So what difference did the giving of the Torah at Mount Sinai create? Before Mount Sinai, mundane materialism did not retain any holiness, any spirituality, any sanctity. If our ancestors took ox hide and made tefillin from it and put on tefillin and said the Shema, as soon as they were done, they can take the ox hide and trash it. It's leather. It's all it really is. It doesn't become holy. It's mundane. It's materialism. Since when can materialism become holiness? It's an oxymoron. We can't say that spirituality is manifested within something physical. Right? The famous philosophical question, I don't remember who asked it, but one of the philosophers, how many angels can dance on the head and the tip of a needle, on the head of a nail? It's an absurd question because it's two different realms, it's two different planes. They don't mix together. So why now do we say that if we use a Torah book and it becomes ripped, we have to bury it in a special way? We kiss a Torah scroll, the scroll becomes holy. Because at Mount Sinai, God said, God, can do the unthinkable, can do the impossible. And I will give the Jewish people the power to permeate physicality, to permeate the mundane materialism and create a spiritual materialistic entity. The Torah scroll, which is hide from an animal, now becomes holy, now becomes a spiritual object. It's something that was impossible before Sinai, but now became a reality because that's what God created. And so the more commandments we do with materialism, the more holy the materialistic world becomes, because ox hide by ox hide, candle by candle, article of food after article of food, computer after computer, or whatever else it is that we're using for holiness, now have this level of spirituality within it. And slowly but surely, we make the whole world holy. That only became possible after the giving of the Torah at Mount Sinai. The words of the Rebbe, page 78, text 8. The difference between the mitzvot performed by the forefathers before the Torah was given and the mitzvot performed by the Jewish people after the Torah was given has been discussed many times. Inasmuch as the mitzvot before the Torah was given weren't obligatory, mandated by God, they were unable to transform the physical material of an object used for a mitzvah to confer upon it the holy status of a mitzvah object. The effect of the mitzvah was only on the person performing it. In other words, the formal command when the Torah was given created the notion of a holy object existing in the world. Something can become a channel for a mitzvah to be performed with and through it. When a person performs the mitzvah, holiness is stamped into a physical object, rendering it a holy object. And so you can't really compare the state of existence before Sinai to the post-Sinai reality, because the whole structure of the universe shifted. By that note, we can now understand the difference between the land of Israel, the way it was in the times of Abraham, to the way it was once it was conquered. In the times of Abraham, the concept of a holy land was an oxymoron. How can land be holy? There is no holiness. There is no spirituality in materialism. Land doesn't become holy. Abraham may have assumed ownership of the land, but there was no sanctity of the land or pertaining to the land in and of itself to speak of. By contrast, following the giving of the Torah at Mount Sinai, now that this novel idea of transformative sanctity at the center of their mission, the land of Israel can now become a holy land, a physical terrain where sanctity is soaked into the very ear and the very dirt of the land. As the Rebbe continues, text 8b, the same applies to the land of Israel. Though the Jewish people already owned the land of Israel before the Torah was given, because God had spoken to that effect, the sanctity couldn't yet be stamped into the physical land. However, after the Torah was given, even before the people conquered it, it became possible for the land to become holy as a result of God's command to conquer it. When the Jewish people took over the land by conquering it, the holiness of the land was established. It's a different land. It's a holy land. It's a Jewish land. And it's in its very dirt, minerals, and air and water, it's all permeated with that divinity, with that sanctity. This level of sanctity, which is saturated into the land, deepens our appreciation of what our claim to the land is to begin with. Events and circumstances come and go. A plot of national real estate changes hands from the Israelites to the Babylonians, to the Romans, to the Turks, to the British, to the government of fierce-looking Israeli, Jewish refugees, Jewish immigrants from all over the world. But the Jewishness of the land of Israel, which is imbued by God, remains constant. And famously, this is presented in the first Rashi of the Torah. Rashi, Rabbeinu Shlomo Yitzchaki, the famous 12th century sage, in his first commentary on the entire Torah, on the book of Genesis, on the first verse, before he even gets to explain the verse itself, Rashi explains something powerful. He explains as follows. This is the first Rashi, his first comment on the Torah, text 9. Rabbi Yitzchak said, shouldn't the Torah have started with the verse, this month is to you, which is the first commandment that the Israelites were commanded? Why then does it begin with, in the beginning, with the story of creation? He asks a very simple question. And it's interesting, some commentaries note that he begins his entire commentary with a statement from a great sage, Rabbi Yitzchak, as an ode to his father, whose name was Yitzchak. Hence his last name, Yitzchaki. So Rabbi Yitzchak, not his father, a different great sage, asked the question in the times of the Talmud and the Midrash about almost 2,000 years ago, and he asked a very simple question. The Torah is a book of laws. It's not a history book. As we see, much of history, even Jewish history, is not in the Torah. It doesn't tell us historical, chronological points. It tells us only aspects of history that are necessary for us to understand the laws. For example, Moses, who's one of the key players of the entire 5 books, right? They're called the 5 books of Moses. Before he becomes the leader of the Jewish people at the age of 80, the Torah tells us a mere 3 or 4 stories of his life in 80 years. Much had went on in those 80 years, but it doesn't tell it to us because those other stories are not necessary for the literal understanding of the laws. So Rabbi Yitzchak has a great question. The entire book of Genesis and the beginning of the book of Exodus is extra. Why does it begin with that? The first law in the Torah is in the beginning, is towards one of the first Torah portions of the book of Exodus. Why does it begin with the account of creation? And he explains as follows. The reason is reflected in the verse. The strength of his works he related to his people to give them the inheritance of the nations. If the nations of the world should say to Israel, you are robbers, for you conquered by force the lands of the 7 nations of Canaan, right? It's not a new cry that we're occupiers. This is a claim, an anti-Semitic claim from thousands of years ago, as the Talmud relates here. It's not something that BDS came up with. It's not something that the squad came up with, or anyone else of our haters of anti-Semites. It's something that is ancient. What's our response to them? Not we have ancient ancestral rights to it. Not that it's what is international law. Not that we needed a homeland. No, none of that. What is our response, says Rabbi Yitzchak? We will reply. The entire earth belongs to the Holy One, blessed be He. He created it and gave it to whomever He deemed proper. When He wished, He gave it to the Canaanites. And when He wished, He took it away from them and gave it to us. But let's unpack this for a moment. Why would they say that we're robbers? The nations of the world understand this idea of conquest, especially talking 2,000 years ago. That's something that every nation did. And no one claimed that that nation were robbers, thieves for conquering another land. It was something which is an everyday reality, right? The great Alexander the Great constantly conquered swaths of land, and no one said he's a robber, because that's how life worked. You conquered land, it became yours. Yalla, let's move on, right? No one complained that everyone else is robbers. Why would they complain that the Jewish people are robbers? So the Rebbe explains something powerful that Rashi is hinting to in his statement. They're claiming that the Jewish people are robbers precisely because of the explanation that we just gave. Normally, when someone conquers a swath of land, it's theirs for however long they can defend it. 50 years, 100 years, 500 years, but 500 years later, someone comes and conquers it from the conquerors. Now it belongs to that third nation. But the Jewish people did something unique. They conquered the land from the Canaanites, and no one can ever conquer it from them. Because the land now is permeated with holiness, the very dirt, the air, the water, the minerals, the vegetation, everything in the land of Israel is permeated with the divinity and permeated with holiness, permeated with sanctity, and permeated with His Jewishness that can never be removed, because it's God who created that reality. And so even if someone comes and conquers it from us, the Babylonians, the Romans, the Ottoman Empire, the British, doesn't matter. It's still ours. It never becomes the conqueror's. We conquered it, and it's ours forever. That's what's unique about the Holy Land. That's why it's ours. Because God gave it to us and permeated the very land with His Jewishness. Talking about conquering the land of Israel reminds me of a joke where they're discussing in the Knesset that they have this issue that the economy is going down and health is going down, immigration is not working out as it should, everything seems to be crumbling. They need ideas on how to revamp the entire country. So one Knesset member raises his hand and he says, I have a suggestion. Look at Europe after World War II. Look at Japan after World War II. The Americans came, leveled Japan, and after they leveled Japan, they invested billions of dollars to rebuild it. Let's start a war with Israel. As is Israel, let's start a war with America. America's going to wipe us out, and then they'll rebuild us, and the economy will be booming. Immigration will have figured out. Our army will be great. Everything will be great. So everyone's discussing. It sounds like a good idea. One old man in the back of the room raises his hand and he says, "What happens if we win?" So that's why the land of Israel is ours, because God gave it to us. In the words of the Rebbe. Text 10 from page 81. Text 10a. The conquest of the land of Israel is different. From when the Jewish people took the lands of the 7 nations, the land itself changed. Before, it had been a land like all other lands, which could belong to any nation, whoever conquered it. But from the moment it was conquered by the Jewish people, it was transformed into the land of Israel, the Holy Land, Eretz Yisrael, a Jewish land through and through, and for all time, to the extent that it can no longer belong to any other nation. The Gentiles also know that once the Jewish people took the lands of the 7 nations, it became Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel, forever. And this is precisely why they claim you are robbers. And as much as before the Jewish people conquered it, it was a land like all others that could belong to any nation. The Jewish people don't have the right to take the land of Israel in such a way that it will be taken from them forever. This, they claim, is robbery. If it can never belong to any other nation, now you're robbing us. You're taking it away from us. And what's the answer to such a claim? The answer is the entire earth belongs to the Holy One, blessed be He. He created it. He has the right to transform the land's quality from one that can be called the lands of the nations to one that is exclusively the land of Israel. And so talking about the Balfour Declaration and history in 1967, it misses the point of what our connection to the land of Israel is all about. There have been times in history when we had control of the land. There have been times in history when we didn't have control. There have been arguments made for and against Israel, some of which are sound and some of which are absurd. But none of that changes the fact that it always remained ours, because the Torah says that this gift is eternal. The Jewish people have an eternal right to the land of Israel. And especially when it is in our hands, as is the case today, we hold on to it dearly, as befits a gift given to us by God. Now, will this argument be effective against non-Jewish anti-Israel voices? Perhaps not. Perhaps yes. After all, many non-Jews do believe in the Bible. Many non-Jews do believe in the Torah. But that's not really the point, because even those who don't respect the Torah will be forced to respect our position as a deeply held religious conviction, not a political position that's subject to change. But the most important audience is our fellow Jews. Perhaps we can't win the non-Jews over with this argument. Perhaps we can't win the anti-Semites, anti-Israel people over with this argument, or at least not easily and quickly. But the Torah's approach can and will strengthen the morale and conviction of our fellow Jews by giving them a strong and stable foundation for their support for Israel. As the Rebbe says in a very, very powerful letter to President Zalman Shazar, who was then the Israeli president in the 1960s, the Rebbe writes as follows. It's a long, long letter. This is an excerpt from the letter. The Rebbe addresses this concern. Text 11. Here's what the Rebbe writes to the Israeli president, Zalman Shazar, who actually came from a Chabad family initially and had very, very close relations with the Rebbe. As a matter of fact, when he came to visit the United States on diplomatic purposes, he actually came to visit the Rebbe in his office. Famously, he took flack for that, but he said that it doesn't matter, he's coming to visit the Rebbe. It's not respectable for the Rebbe to come and visit him. This is a letter that the Rebbe writes to him. I have received complaints. Why do I invoke the biblical land of Israel, the Holy Land, and the covenant with Abraham in connection with modern Israel? Why do I mix God into the picture? After all, they say, those who fought for the creation of the state, those who led it, those who currently direct it, and its authorized representatives, they all proclaim and take pains to emphasize that Israel is a state founded in 1948. Says the Rebbe, my answer, put frankly, is that their narrative is false. No new entity was created in 1948. Rather, that was the year in which a large part of the land of Israel was liberated. Key, it wasn't a new entity that was created. A large part of the land of Israel was liberated. An entity established in 1948 based on the agreement or authorization of the nations of the world has no strength or justification in terms of an authentic response to the claim, you are thieves for having conquered lands belonging to others, etc., which is a claim raised by the Arabs, the Vatican, the United Nations, and some Jews as well. This is why it is so crucial to underscore that it is our God-given homeland. Now, I do not delude myself into imagining that these just and honest arguments will prevail in the United Nations, the Vatican, etc. Nevertheless, transmitting this truth is critical for the morale of Jewish youth living in the Holy Land, including those serving in the IDF, for Jewish American students, and for the Jewish youth of other countries as well. Other times, the Rebbe would always stress the fact that if we stress it enough times and we believe in it and we talk about it to other people, even the non-Jews, even the United Nations, the Vatican will start respecting this reason, will accept it as well. We need to emphasize how Israel is not only a land with promise, but also the promised land. We need to teach about it. We need to talk about it. We need to live it, this idea that there's a covenant that God has with Abraham and with his descendants and all the Jewish people afterwards, that it is ours. It is ours because God gave it to us and God permeated the land, that it is ours. It's a Jewish land given to us by God. And that's why it is ours. Now, will this change the minds of non-Jews who are sworn enemies of the Jews and of Israel? Unlikely. Can it have some effect on non-Jews? And some non-Jews? Of course, and it will. But what's most crucial is that we make sure that we know it ourselves. We live it ourselves. We know that that's the basis of our claim to the land of Israel. And we encourage others to study it and to talk about it and to teach it, especially to the youth and Jews around the world, to give them strength, to give them a foundation to base their argument on. Because this is the truth. This is the reality. And when fewer Jews join the anti-Israel groups, we'll be far more successful in combating anti-Israel activity. And we're able to focus much more on the real mission of Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel, of living as a holy nation in a holy land and realizing the purpose for which the world was created.